Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to waste their life. It happens in inches. One skipped workout that becomes a skipped month. One postponed project that becomes a postponed year. One morning of scrolling instead of creating that becomes 10,000 mornings of scrolling instead of creating. And the strangest part is that it never feels like decay while it's happening. It feels like rest, like flexibility, like being kind to yourself. That's what makes it so perfectly engineered to destroy you. It wears the disguise of something reasonable. Meanwhile, there are people who seem to operate on a completely different operating system. Not more talented. Not genetically gifted with discipline. Just running different software. And the gap between those two groups comes down to 7 specific habits that don't just build momentum. They create a form of psychological addiction so powerful that going back to the old life starts to feel physically impossible. Here's what most people get wrong about habits. They think habits are about repetition. Do something 21 days in a row, and boom, you're transformed. That number, by the way, comes from a plastic surgeon in the 1960s who noticed patients took about 3 weeks to get used to their new face. Somehow, that became the gold standard for habit formation. A study out of University College London actually tracked how long it takes for a behavior to become automatic. The real number? 66 days on average. Some habits took over 250 days. So, right out of the gate, the entire popular model of habit building is based on a misquoted cosmetic surgeon from 6 decades ago. That's what the self-improvement industry is built on. But here's the thing about habits that actually stick, the kind that rewire your identity so deeply that going back to your old life feels physically uncomfortable. They don't work through repetition alone. They work through addiction. Not the destructive kind, the kind that Miyamoto Musashi described when he wrote about the way, the path that once walked becomes impossible to abandon. The kind that makes a monk wake up at 4 in the morning, not because an alarm forces him to, but because sleeping past 4 feels like betrayal. That kind of addiction to growth, to change, to becoming something more than yesterday's version of yourself. And it starts with 7 very specific habits that most people either ignore entirely or execute so badly they might as well not bother. The first habit sounds almost offensively simple, and that's exactly why it works. Wake up before the world tells you what to think. Not just early, before input, before your phone. Before news, notifications, emails, texts, social media, before any external voice enters your head and starts dictating your emotional state for the day. A researcher at the University of California, Irvine found that it takes an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds to fully regain focus after a single interruption. 23 minutes. And most people pick up their phone within 3 minutes of opening their eyes, which means before their feet even hit the floor, they've already handed the steering wheel of their mind to someone else's agenda. Now, here's the thing about this that nobody tells you. It's not about waking up at 5 a.m. The specific hour is irrelevant. What matters is the gap, the space between consciousness and consumption. Experienced practitioners of Zen meditation call this the golden window, that period where your mind hasn't yet been colonized by external noise, where your thoughts are actually your own. One former military officer who spent 20 years studying peak performance put it this way: the first hour of your day is the rudder of the ship. Wherever it points, the rest follows. Most people let Twitter set the rudder. Sounds dramatic, right? But think about the last time you woke up and immediately saw something that annoyed you on your phone. A stupid comment. A depressing headline. A work email that set your teeth on edge. How did the rest of that day go? Exactly. Now, compare it to one of those rare mornings where you woke up naturally, sat in silence for a few minutes, maybe had coffee while staring out the window, thinking about nothing in particular. Those days feel different. They feel like yours. And that difference isn't psychological fluff. brain imaging studies show that the default mode network, the part of your brain responsible for self-reflection and creative problem-solving, is most active in the absence of external stimulation. You're literally smarter, more creative, and more emotionally stable when you protect that first window. The habit isn't waking up early. The habit is waking up sovereign. But building this gap alone won't transform your life, because what you do inside that gap matters even more. The second habit is where things start getting uncomfortable, and that discomfort is the entire point. Pursue the thing you're avoiding first. Every single day, there's one task, one conversation, one action that your brain is quietly trying to steer you away from. Maybe it's that difficult phone call. Maybe it's the workout. Maybe it's the creative project you keep saying you'll start next week. Your subconscious knows exactly what it is, even if you won't admit it consciously. There's a concept in behavioral psychology called the Zeigarnik effect, named after a Soviet psychologist who noticed something fascinating about waiters in the 1920s. They could remember complex, incomplete orders with perfect accuracy, but forgot them instantly once the order was served. The brain holds on to unfinished tasks with an almost obsessive grip. That thing you're avoiding? Your brain is spending energy on it all day long, every day whether you act on it or not. It's running in the background like a program you can't close, draining your processing power, creating a low-level hum of anxiety that colors everything else you do. Here's the thing about avoidance. It compounds. Every day you dodge the hard thing, the resistance gets slightly stronger. Not dramatically, maybe 2 or 3% harder. But compound that over weeks, months, years, and you end up with people who are terrified of making a simple phone call. People who haven't been to the gym in so long that the idea of walking through those doors feels genuinely impossible. The resistance grew so slowly they didn't notice it building. Like a frog in water that heats 1 degree at a time. One retired Navy instructor described it as debt with invisible interest. You think you're just postponing, but you're borrowing confidence from your future self at a rate you can't see. The habit is simple but brutal. Identify the thing you least want to do. Do it first. Before email. Before easy tasks. Before the comfortable stuff that makes you feel productive without actually moving the needle. Makes sense, right? The hard part isn't understanding this. The hard part is that your brain will generate genuinely compelling reasons to do it later. It will tell you that you need to prepare more, that the timing isn't right, that you should warm up with easier tasks first. Every single one of those reasons is a lie your comfort zone tells to keep you imprisoned. And once you start eating the hard thing first, something weird happens. The rest of the day feels downhill. That low-level anxiety vanishes. You walk differently, not metaphorically. Your actual posture changes when you've already conquered the thing you feared. Pretty clever design, actually. Evolution wired you to feel like a conqueror after facing threats. The problem is, modern life lets you avoid every threat indefinitely, so you never get that conqueror feeling. You just get the hum. But conquering the hard task is useless if the next habit isn't in place, because most people immediately fill the void with something that pulls them right back down. If you're ready to stop negotiating with your comfort zone and start conquering your hardest task first, go deeper with the KMA method. It's a practical system you apply in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the pinned comment. The third habit is one that ancient warriors understood instinctively, but modern people have almost completely abandoned. Guard your inputs like your life depends on it, because neurologically it does. The average person consumes about 34 gigabytes of information per day. That number comes from a University of California, San Diego study. And it doesn't even account for passive consumption, the billboards, the background television, the conversations you overhear. Your brain processes all of it, whether you're paying attention or not. Every piece of information that enters your mind triggers a neurochemical response. Negative news spikes cortisol. Social media comparison triggers a complex cocktail of dopamine and inadequacy. Gossip activates tribal threat detection circuits that evolved for actual survival situations, but now fire over celebrity drama and internet arguments. Here's the thing about information consumption that most people completely miss. It's not neutral. There's no such thing as passively watching the news for just a few minutes with no effect. A study published in the British Journal of Psychology found that just 14 minutes of negative news significantly increased both anxiety and sadness, and those effects persisted for hours after viewing. Not days, not the whole afternoon, but hours of altered emotional state from 14 minutes of consumption. Multiply that by every scroll session, every notification, every autoplay video, and you start to see the real picture. Most people are spending 8 to 12 hours a day marinating their brain in content that actively makes them worse, then wondering why they can't find the motivation to change their lives. One Zen principle puts this with zero ambiguity. You are not what you eat. You are what you let into your mind. Musashi himself was obsessive about this. He famously distanced himself from entertainment, gossip, and idle conversation, not because he was antisocial, but because he understood that attention is the most valuable currency a human possesses, and spending it on garbage makes you poor in every way that matters. The practical application is ruthless but simple. Audit every single input channel in your life. Social media accounts that make you feel inadequate? Gone. News sources that profit from your outrage? Eliminated. Friends whose primary conversational mode is complaining? Limited. This sounds extreme, and people always push back on it. They say, you can't just cut everything out, you need to stay informed, you need social connection. And they're right. But there's a massive difference between curated, intentional consumption and the all-you-can-eat buffet of digital noise that most people subject themselves to daily. The habit is building a filter, a gate, deciding with intention what gets through to your conscious mind and what gets blocked at the door. But here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody wants to hear about filtering your inputs. It doesn't matter what you keep out if what you're putting in is empty. This is where the fourth habit separates people who talk about change from people who actually become unrecognizable. Make learning non-negotiable, not optional, not something that happens when you have time, not a hobby, a daily discipline with the same priority as eating and sleeping. The average American reads about 4 books per year. The average Fortune 500 chief executive reads about 4 to 5 books per month. That's not a coincidence. That's a compounding advantage that, over a decade, creates a knowledge gap so vast it might as well be a different species. But here's the thing about learning, that the typical advice gets catastrophically wrong. Reading more books isn't the point. Consuming information isn't learning. Learning is the process of taking new information, connecting it to existing knowledge, and then applying it in a way that changes behavior. You can read 50 books on fitness and still be out of shape. You can listen to every podcast on financial literacy and still be broke. The consumption isn't the habit, the integration is. One method that shows up across multiple traditions, from Stoic philosophy to Japanese martial arts to modern cognitive science, is the practice of daily reflection on what was learned. Not journaling in the vague, write about your feelings sense. Specific, targeted review. What did you learn today that you didn't know yesterday? How does it connect to what you already know? What will you do differently tomorrow because of it? Samurai scholars called this hansei, the practice of honest self-reflection that was considered so essential to mastery that a warrior who failed to practice it daily was considered negligent regardless of his skill with a sword. A modern neuroscience explanation validates this completely. The hippocampus consolidates short-term memories into long-term knowledge primarily during reflective states and sleep. Without deliberate reflection, most of what you consume literally never makes it into permanent storage. It's like filling a bathtub with the drain open. Lots of water flowing, nothing accumulating. The practical habit is 15 to 20 minutes of daily learning followed immediately by 5 minutes of written reflection. Not consumed, applied, not read, integrated. The difference sounds subtle, but the results over 6 months are staggering. People who practice active learning with reflection retain roughly 4 to 5 times more usable knowledge than passive consumers. But even with a protected morning, conquered hard tasks, filtered inputs, and active learning, there's a fifth habit that acts as the multiplier for everything else, and getting it wrong can negate all 4 previous habits entirely. The fifth habit is the one that makes people the most uncomfortable because it requires a kind of honesty that modern culture actively discourages. Measure everything that matters. Not with feelings, not with vague sense of progress, with actual numbers. There's a principle in management science that's been repeated so often it's become almost cliché, but it became cliché because it's devastatingly true. What gets measured gets managed. What doesn't get measured gets stories. And stories are where self-deception lives. The human brain is spectacularly talented at constructing narratives that make you feel better about a lack of progress. You didn't skip the gym, you were listening to your body. You didn't waste 4 hours on social media, you were networking and staying informed. You didn't fail to save money, you invested in experiences. Every excuse has a story that sounds completely reasonable from the inside. Measurement murders those stories. It doesn't argue with them, it doesn't try to motivate past them. It just presents a number that either went up, went down, or stayed the same. And numbers don't negotiate. Here's the thing about measurement that surprises most people. The act of tracking itself changes behavior even before you try to improve the numbers. A study from the Kaiser Permanente Center for Health Research found that people who kept a daily food journal lost nearly twice as much weight as those who didn't keep any records. They weren't given different diets. They weren't given different exercise plans. The only variable was whether or not they wrote down what they ate. The mere act of observation altered behavior. Quantum physicists call this the observer effect. Psychologists call it self-monitoring. Whatever you call it, the mechanism is identical. Awareness precedes change. You cannot improve what you refuse to honestly observe. The practical application isn't complicated. Pick 3 to 5 metrics that represent genuine progress in your life. Not vanity metrics. Not feel-good indicators. Real numbers tied to real outcomes. Track them daily. Review them weekly, adjust monthly. One experienced executive coach described his clients' transformations in almost clinical terms. Before tracking, they had opinions about their progress. After tracking, they had evidence. And the difference between opinion-based living and evidence-based living is roughly the same as the difference between hoping you'll arrive somewhere and using a map. But tracking alone creates a new problem that catches almost everyone off guard. And without the 6th habit in place, measurement can actually become a trap that makes you worse. Here's where the conversation shifts from what you do to who you become. And this distinction matters more than most people realize. The 6th habit is the deliberate practice of identity editing. Not affirmations, not positive thinking. Not staring in a mirror telling yourself you're a champion. Something far more surgical, far more effective, and grounded in actual cognitive science rather than wishful thinking. The brain doesn't process identity the way most self-help suggests. You don't change who you are by repeating statements about who you want to be. You change who you are by accumulating evidence that supports a new identity until the old one becomes statistically unsupportable. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you believe yourself to be. Skip the gym, and you've cast a vote for the identity of someone who doesn't work out. Show up and do even 10 minutes on the treadmill, and you cast a vote for someone who exercises. No single vote determines the election. But over hundreds and thousands of votes, a clear winner emerges. This is why small actions matter far more than grand gestures. The person who does 5 push-ups every single day for a year has cast 365 votes for their identity as someone who exercises. The person who does an intense 2-hour workout once a month has cast 12 votes. Mathematically, the 5 push-up person has built an identity roughly 30 times stronger. Sounds backwards, right? But this is exactly how the basal ganglia, the brain region responsible for habit encoding, actually functions. It doesn't care about intensity, it cares about frequency. It's counting repetitions of identity-confirming behavior and adjusting your self-concept accordingly. Here's the thing about identity that makes this so powerful and so dangerous at the same time. Your behavior will always eventually align with your identity. Always. You can force yourself to act against your self-concept for a while through willpower and motivation, but the moment that external pressure drops, you'll snap back to whoever you believe yourself to be. This is why people lose weight and gain it back. They change the behavior without changing the identity. They were still a heavy person on a diet rather than a fit person who eats well. The snapback isn't failure of willpower. It's identity gravity, and it's one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. The practical habit is startlingly simple. At the end of each day, answer one question in writing. What did I do today that the person I'm becoming would do? Not the person I want to be someday. The person I'm becoming, present tense, active transition. This framing matters enormously. Future tense identity creates distance. Present tense becoming creates momentum. One psychologist who studied long-term behavioral change across over 1,200 subjects found that the single strongest predictor of sustained transformation wasn't goal clarity, accountability, or even environment design. It was identity shift. The people who said, "I am becoming someone who fills in the blank," were roughly 3 times more likely to maintain changes at the 18-month mark than people who said, "I want to fill in the blank." The difference between becoming and wanting is the difference between movement and wishing. But identity editing without the 7th habit is like building a beautiful house on sand. It'll look impressive right up until it collapses, and the collapse tends to come at the worst possible moment. The 7th habit is the one that ties every other habit into a system that self-reinforces instead of self-destructs. And it's the one that most people resist the hardest because it feels counterintuitive to everything the modern productivity world teaches. The 7th habit is strategic rest, not relaxation, not Netflix and decompression, not the passive collapse at the end of an exhausting day. Deliberate, engineered recovery designed to make the other 6 habits sustainable for years instead of weeks. There's a concept in exercise science called supercompensation. When you stress a muscle, it doesn't grow during the workout. It grows during recovery. The workout creates the stimulus. Rest creates the adaptation. Without adequate recovery, the same stimulus that makes you stronger starts making you weaker. This isn't just an exercise principle. It's a universal law of biological systems, and your brain is a biological system. Chronic stress without recovery doesn't build mental toughness. It builds cortisol accumulation, prefrontal cortex degradation, and decision fatigue that gets progressively worse over time. A study from the American Institute of Stress found that chronic stress literally shrinks the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for planning, decision-making, and impulse control, the exact faculties you need most for maintaining habits. So the grind without rest mentality doesn't just feel bad, it physically damages the hardware you need for change. Here's the thing about strategic rest that separates it from ordinary laziness. It's planned, it's boundaried, and it serves a specific function. Monks in contemplative traditions didn't rest because they were tired. They rested because rest was part of the technology of transformation. The tea ceremony wasn't a break from training, it was training. Musashi's long periods of isolation and artistic pursuit weren't vacations from the way of the sword. They were deepenings of it. Strategic rest has 3 components, and most people get 0 of the 3 right. The first is physical recovery, actual sleep, not the interrupted, phone on the nightstand, mind still racing version that most people call sleep. The data on sleep deprivation is so extreme it almost sounds made up. After 17 hours without sleep, cognitive impairment equals a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05. After 24 hours, it equals 0.1, which is legally drunk in every state. Most people operating on 5 to 6 hours of sleep per night are making major life decisions with the cognitive capacity of someone who's had several drinks. Every single day, for years. The second component is mental recovery, periods of genuine cognitive rest where the brain isn't processing, planning, or consuming. Walking without podcasts. Sitting without scrolling. Being without performing. The default mode network, the same brain system mentioned earlier that powers creativity and self-reflection, requires genuine idle time to function. It can't do its job while you're doing yours. The third component is emotional recovery, processing the psychological load of growth rather than just accumulating it. Change is emotionally expensive. Every habit you build, every identity shift you make, every hard thing you conquer first thing in the morning comes with an emotional cost that needs to be metabolized. Unprocessed emotional load becomes resentment toward the very changes you're trying to make. It's why people who go hard on self-improvement sometimes suddenly and violently abandon everything. They didn't fail. They just never processed the emotional cost of sustained change, and eventually the bill came due all at once. One therapist who specialized in high-performer burnout described it with an analogy that stuck. Imagine you're renovating a house while living in it. Every day there's dust, noise, disruption, things not working, inconvenience. If you never clean up, never ventilate, never take a moment to appreciate what's being built, you'll eventually burn the whole thing down just to make the noise stop. The renovation itself isn't the problem. The lack of processing is. Strategic rest is the ventilation. It's the cleanup. It's the moment where you step back and see the house taking shape rather than just enduring the construction. The practical application has 3 parts. Protect sleep with the same ferocity you'd protect a newborn. 7 to 9 hours, consistent schedule, no negotiation. Build in at least 30 minutes daily of genuine cognitive rest. No inputs, no screens, no productivity. And weekly, take at minimum several hours for emotional processing, whether that's journaling, conversation with someone you trust, time in nature, meditation, or whatever form allows you to actually feel what you've been carrying rather than just pushing through it. Here's what happens when these 7 habits work together as a system rather than a checklist. The morning sovereignty protects the space where identity editing happens. Conquering the hard thing first builds the evidence that identity editing requires. Filtering inputs prevents external contamination of the new identity being constructed. Active learning provides the raw material for growth. Measurement prevents self-deception from derailing progress. Identity editing ensures that behavioral changes become permanent rather than temporary. And strategic rest makes the entire system sustainable rather than a burnout countdown. Each habit feeds the others. Remove one, and the system degrades. But keep all 7 running, even imperfectly, even at 50% execution, and something starts to happen around the 6 to 8 week mark that catches most people completely off guard. The system becomes self-reinforcing. Waking up sovereign feels so good that you start protecting sleep more fiercely, which improves recovery, which gives you more energy for the hard task, which builds identity evidence, which makes you more selective about inputs, which accelerates learning, which improves the metrics you're tracking, which reinforces the identity, which makes you want to protect the morning even more. It becomes a flywheel, and once a flywheel is spinning, it takes less energy to maintain than it took to start. That's the addiction, not the hollow dopamine chase of social media or the fleeting rush of motivation after watching an inspiring video. A deep, structural, neurologically wired pull toward continuing the cycle because every component reinforces every other component. People who reach this state describe it in remarkably similar terms regardless of background, culture, or starting point. They say it feels like they've been asleep their whole life and just woke up. They say going back to the old patterns feels physically repulsive, not because of willpower, but because their identity has shifted so fundamentally that the old behaviors no longer fit, like trying to wear clothes from when you were 12. They still exist. You just can't put them on anymore. One man who went through this process described the moment he knew something had permanently shifted. He was at a party, the kind of gathering he used to live for, loud music, drinks flowing, and everyone performing their best version of themselves for the crowd. And he felt nothing, not superior, not judgmental, just disconnected from it in the way you feel disconnected from a TV show you used to love as a kid. The attachment wasn't there anymore. Not because he forced it away, but because he had genuinely become someone for whom that environment no longer resonated. He left early, went home, read for an hour, and went to sleep. And the next morning, he woke up before his alarm, made his coffee in silence, and started his day with the quiet certainty of someone who knows exactly who they are and where they're going. The uncomfortable truth that nobody in the self-improvement space wants to admit is this: transformation isn't about finding the right hack or the perfect morning routine or the one weird trick that changes everything. It's about building a system of interlocking habits that become a self-reinforcing identity machine. It's not glamorous. It doesn't photograph well for social media. Most days, it looks like a person quietly waking up, doing the hard thing, filtering the noise, learning something, tracking a number, editing their identity, and resting with intention. No transformation montage. No dramatic before and after. Just the slow, steady accumulation of votes for the person you are becoming, cast one day at a time, until one morning you wake up and realize with startling clarity that you're not the same person who started this. And the strangest part, the part that nobody prepares you for, is that you can't pinpoint the day it happened. There was no single moment of transformation. There was just a system, running daily, compounding quietly, until the person in the mirror became someone new. That's not motivation. That's not discipline. That's architecture. And once it's built, it doesn't need motivation to sustain itself. It just runs. The only question left is whether you'll spend another year consuming content about change, or whether today is the day you actually build the system. Because here's the thing about that question. You already know the answer. You've known it the entire time.